Hi friends, I hope all is well. This is part 2 of my series where I create collages on top of ground layers from my 30 simple ways to start a collage video. I'll link both videos in the description area if you haven't watched them yet or want to refer back to them. Like with part 1, there's an inspirational collage located in the upper left corner for each collaging section. I chose this collage to use as inspiration for this ground layer because the individual geometric shapes will work with the existing painted elements. I will add different elements as well. Also, I want to keep some of the white paper showing. This is hard for me to do because I like to cover the whole surface with color. To help me with this, I'm thinking of it as white elements, not a blank section of the ground layer. As you can probably guess, this new collage won't be an exact copy of the inspirational collage. One more thing before I add music, I didn't mention in part 1 that I tend to pull more papers than necessary because I like to have options. Also, I don't want to stop the creative flow by having to search for papers. With that said, I'll come back once the collage is finished so we can discuss it. I'm still getting used to having some blank white paper showing in a collage. It's a challenge for me, but I know it will help my art practice grow. I think this collage is cohesive and balanced. Like in part 1, I'll include grayscale versions so you can easily see the different values. This is one that I want to recreate the inspirational collage design larger to see how it will look. The small inspirational collage, which is 4.5 by 6 inches, has white negative space, so I'll change the placement of the color papers for this new collage. The large element will be a light value instead of dark, so it will contrast with the ground layer and remain the focal point. Also, the small elements that will be placed around the two sides of the focal point will be mid to dark value. I don't want these small elements to distract from the large light value focal point. I will keep the edges of all the elements torn to mimic the ones in the original collage. Also, I'm constructing it the same way with the focal point being glued last. It will slightly overlap the edges of the other elements. This small detail will help bring the large light element forward, reinforcing it as a focal point. I think this design works well as a larger collage. If I do recreate it in the same size, which is 8 by 11 inches or larger, I will change the placement a bit. Either move the whole collage layer up so there's less of the ground layer showing at the top, or I'll make the focal point slightly taller, which will move the horizontal elements up. Another option would be to add another horizontal layer of small elements. This is another inspirational collage design that I want to recreate larger but with a different color palette. Again, I want to see if this design will work when it's scaled up to 8 by 11 inches. Of course, it won't be an exact copy because the color palette will be different. I want to lean into the blue watercolor ground by using bright colors. I'll be mindful of having all three values represented. The painted ground layer has light to mid-tone values, with the light value being the top section and the mid-tone value being the middle to lower section. At this point, the collage had the same design as the inspirational collage, but it looked unfinished to me. I felt it needed a few more smaller elements. You're seeing me cut small elements that will be placed along the inner edge of the orange element. Once I'm finished with this area, then I'm moving on to the large narrow element to the right of it. It looked plain to me as well, so I will add an element on top of it. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, the original design looked a bit plain when it was scaled up to 8 by 11 inches. That's why I added small elements along the edge of the large orange element and added a thin, long orange element on top of the large blue one. These additions to the original design made this collage successful. I chose this inspirational collage because its design would fit with the design of this ground layer. I will make some adjustments because there is room to add more elements. I realized that this collage would need design adjustments after working on collages 13 and 14. 13 has a similar design to this one. When reviewing collage 13, I mentioned changing the placement of the elements so there's less ground layers showing at the top of the collage. So I'm being mindful of that for this collage. The dome-shaped focal point is taller than the one in the inspirational collage. Also with the previous collage, I went back and added smaller and thinner elements to make the areas of the design less plain looking. So more elements will be added to this collage. Instead of one horizontal row of block-shaped elements, I'm starting to add a smaller, thinner horizontal row below it. I like how this collage turned out. It makes me think about adding another horizontal row of elements to collage 13. We'll see. I like how there's enough of the ground layer still showing. There's a balance between the ground layer and the collage on top. Also, adding another thin vertical element at the top helped that area to look finished. Odd number of elements is visually pleasing to me. This next collage will be loosely inspired by the inspirational collage. I like the straight and diagonal edge elements in that collage. I like the design, but again, I'm limited by the painted elements on the ground layer. It's better to use the design of the elements, not the design as a whole. Also, I'm changing the color palette to coordinate with the muted colors of the stamped bubble wrap ground layer. The number of colors used will be limited as well. I consider the ground layer to be busy, so I want to slightly tone that down. Limiting the colors used and the number of elements will help. My plan is to change the ground layer to be seen as elements. I hope that makes sense. I don't want the viewer to see the collage as two separate parts, ground layer and collage elements. I want it to be seen as one cohesive layer. Let's see if I can do that. Here's the finished collage. It's a bit outside my usual style, but I like it. The shapes of some of the paper elements are cut and placed so the ground layer underneath it has a similar angled shapes. It's easily seen in the grayscale version. The ground layer is considered the light value, while the paper elements are mid to dark values. I think I was able to combine the ground layer into elements. I knew right away that this small collage would be a good inspiration for this next ground layer. What drew me to it was the grouping of elements on the right side. I could see that it was loosely similar with the stenciling on the right side of the ground layer. My design plan is to build the collage mostly on the blank side, but to have at least one element overlapping on the stencil area. By doing that, it will tie the two sides together. Those elements will have simple shapes like the inspirational collage, but I'll use pattern papers for all the elements. This will elevate the simple shapes. Also, I'll leave some of the white paper showing. I think it will work with this design. I need to push myself to incorporate white negative space more often in my collages. The finished collage references the inspirational collage, but it isn't a copy. I'm glad I left some of the white paper showing. Besides the reasons I mentioned earlier, having some of the white paper on the left side of the page helps to balance the collage since there's white paper showing underneath the stencil area. This is another small collage that I knew right away which ground layer would be a good match. Even though the ground layer is flipped, I can see I can draw inspiration from the small collage. The papers will be placed within the area that hasn't been stamped. Again, I'll be cutting simple shapes with pattern papers and leaving some of the white paper untouched. Like the previous collage, leaving some of the white paper untouched helped to balance the collage since there's white paper showing under the stamped area. I like the overall design of this collage. I made a note to use it more often in my art practice. You can see that it has strong light, mid, and dark values when looking at the grayscale version. This inspirational collage has a similar design to collage 6 in part 1 of this series, so I'm going to address the large element in the same way, meaning the ground layer design will be the large element. I'm using a template for that element, and I'll be painting around it this time instead of drawing a pencil line first. I sped up the video, but in real time, I slowly and carefully applied the light yellow-orange paint around the template. I left a little space between the edge of the template and where I was painting to avoid any of the paint seeping under the template. I'm using an angle brush for painting this area, then I'll come in with a 1-inch flat brush to paint the rest of the ground. Like collage 6, I won't be applying the paint thick, so some of the circular pattern on the ground will show through. Now that the paint has dried, it's time to start collaging. It's another design that I want to see if it works as an 8 by 11-inch collage. I'm taking the design from the inspirational collage and slightly changing it. I'm keeping the color palette muted and using mid to dark value papers because the ground layer is a light value. I think this design works as an 8 by 11 inch size because I added a few more elements. I like how the large element was created by painting the ground layer to make the shape. Also, I like the strong value contrast. To be honest, I chose this inspirational collage because it was one of the remaining ones that wasn't matched up with a ground layer. Since this ground layer has an all-over pattern, any of the other inspirational collages would have worked as well. The collage and ground layer will be seen as two separate units, but I still need to be mindful of it being cohesive. The design will still have two large elements with small elements where they meet. I'm not interested in seeing how this exact design will look larger. I'm more interested in seeing how it will look with more papers within each of the larger elements. Also, the color palette will be different. The ground layer colors are cool tone, so I'm going to lean into a bright, cool tone color palette. Flipping the design upside down works just as well as it does right side up. The busy all over ground layer does not distract from the elements on top of it. I'm surprised that instead of two separate units, ground layer and collage elements, it looks like one cohesive and balanced collage. This inspirational collage is a good fit for this stained ground layer. I'm using the diagonal design elements but change the direction. Some of the ground layer will be visible in this area, like the inspirational collage. Also, the color palette will be different to coordinate with the muted ground layer. At this point, the collage could have been finished because it has the elements in the same area as the inspirational collage, but it looked unfinished to me. I wanted to add a few more paper elements to the top and bottom areas, not too many and not too strong of a color. Using this orange paper will tie in with the orange section of the ground layer. Also, it won't distract from the main diagonal section. This is a collage design that's outside my usual style, but I'm happy with the way it turned out. I'm glad I added the 3 orange pieces of paper so the collage looks finished. This is the last collage for this video. Part 3, which is the final video in this series, will be live sometime before the end of this month. Let's talk about why this inspirational collage was chosen for this ground layer. It came about when I was pulling papers for another collage. I saw the paper that is right below the image of the inspirational collage. It's the one that has a thick black line dome shape on yellow oxide ground. That shape reminded me of the yellow oxide dome on the inspirational collage. It's a very loose inspiration, but it was a good starting point. This new collage will not be a copy of the inspirational one. It won't have an uneven square shape, but it will have a large curve shape. The first thing to do is to finish building the orange section of the ground layer. I decided on the subtle orange pattern paper that matches the color of the orange bleeding tissue paper. I didn't want to introduce a new color in this area because I didn't want the overall look of the collage to be too busy. I will introduce a new color in the upper left area after I glue in place the black dome-shaped paper. I don't want to get ahead of myself, so I'll add music at this point and come back after the black dome-shaped paper is glued in place. I didn't want a dark color paper for the upper left area. It would distract from the black dome paper, so I decided on this off-white and burgundy pattern paper. It has a mid-tone value like the orange area. Instead of using one piece of it, I thought it'd be more interesting if I tore it into smaller pieces. It's a small detail, but I think it was needed. Once this section is completed, then I'll work on the final element, which is the large curved shape. This collage design took a turn in a different direction once I started using the bright blue paper for the large curved shape. If I had used a dark muted color for this element, it would still work, but the bright blue paper elevated the design. In my opinion, it's unexpected in a good way. Well, that wraps up part 2 of this series. I encourage you to use a collage design that you like and reimagine it with a different ground layer or color palette or both. I hope you'll come back for part 3, which is the final video. Let me know if you have any questions. Take care.